Good evening, colleagues. My name's Janet Lauritsen, and I'm really very honored this evening to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Karen Heimer, President of the American Society of Criminology. Karen is professor and recent chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Iowa. She's also professor in Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies and an affiliate of the Public Policy Center at the university. Professor Heimer received a bachelor's degree in psychology, and after working for a while in the juvenile justice system, she began graduate studies in psychology at the University of Wisconsin. During her graduate coursework, she was introduced to sociological perspectives on structural inequalities and other important related social influences. And so after completing her MA degree in psychology, she switched to the sociology program at Madison for her PhD work. Her dissertation, completed in 1989, was one of a small number of studies at the time to explicitly study the role of gender in the development of delinquency. I'm sure this audience is aware of her research accomplishments, but many of you may not know how long-standing they've been or the depth and breadth of her work. Her earliest research examined the social, psychological, and group processes involved in juvenile delinquency. She was one of the pioneers in empirically testing symbolic interactionism, differential association, and social control theories, especially as they help us to understand how gender, race, family structure, and other processes affect youth involvement in crime. Her early work furthered others' prior efforts to bring feminist insights about gender norms and social controls into traditional criminological theories, and she has shown through careful analyses how these processes influence girls' and boys' behaviors, and how girls have been more often controlled indirectly through their socialization experiences that emphasize emotional bonds to others. Professor Heimer continued her rigorous and comparative examinations of gendered patterns of offending when she later turned her attention to the macro level, investigating how broader factors such as women's economic marginalization may be responsible for what appeared to be the beginnings of a reduction in the gender gap in some forms of offending. And it was shortly after these publications appeared that she and I first met and began our research partnership to study the gender gap in various forms of victimization as well as other related issues. She's also expert in the study of women's imprisonment trends and how race and structural differences in women's lives influence the pattern in these data. And these are just a few examples to show her unique depth and breadth of knowledge, ranging from the micro social psychological processes involved in offending and victimization to the macro forces underlying crime and social control. Her work is always theoretically grounded, methodologically rigorous, and helps us to better understand the empirical complexities that appear in the data. I know I'm not the only one who deeply appreciates her intellect and contributions to her field. For her teaching, she's received the University of Iowa Collegiate Teaching Award 1997, the university's President and Provost Teaching Award in 2006. In 2018, she received the college's Distinguished Collegiate Fellow Award and the University of Iowa's Regents Award for Faculty Excellence in Teaching, Research, and Service. Her research contributions have been recognized when she received the Distinguished Scholar Award from the ASC Division on Women and Crime in 2012, and when she was named Fellow of the ASC for her sustained and cumulative contributions to the field of criminology. And she has managed to maintain the highest levels of excellence throughout her career in all aspects of our profession, while remaining a kind and generous colleague and mentor to many. She is dedicated and a joy to work with. She remains appropriately humble, but she is also a force to be reckoned with. I'd like to thank Karen personally for being such a thoughtful and helpful friend and colleague, and I ask you all to help me thank her for her dedication and service to the ASC and to welcome her to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet, for that such a kind introduction and for being such a wonderful collaborator and friend. And again, hearty thanks to Ambassador Young, who's honored us today. I have a few other thank yous to begin. I think I'm supposed to, I haven't practiced this. Nope, I don't want to do that. Okay. Thank you to the program committee who did a fabulous job this year. The committee, as some of you know from experience, involves a great deal of work. So I'm very grateful to all of you who served this year. The program committee's program co-chairs, Stacy DeCoster and Lisa Broidy, did a masterful job of working with the program committee this year. And with Susan Case to create our meeting. So huge thanks to Stacy and Lisa for that, and also for being great friends and collaborators. And again, thanks to Susan Case, if she's here, for all the work of scheduling the sessions and setting the program. Thanks to Chris, Susan Case, and the ASC staff for making the meeting a success and all of your work for ASC this year. I also want to thank Jim Lynch for working together in our overlapping terms of president-elect, president, and past president. And thanks to the board for all of the work. We have actually a really great dedicated board, everybody. We should give them a round of applause, too. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time as president this year. I've gotten to know many members better, and I've seen firsthand the tireless work of many to make the organization strong. I've been especially impressed with the work of the division chairs who are committed and energetic leaders, and I thank everybody for the honor and privilege of serving as president this year. And finally, I need to thank my family, especially Joe, who puts up with me and shares my family and intellectual life, and also a lot of thanks for the past few weeks. Okay, now I think I can do this. Oh.
Green arrow.
Okay, no, I see. Okay, got it. In 1943, this was Norman Rockwell's vision of the classic Thanksgiving dinner in America. Today, our vision of Thanksgiving dinner is better depicted by the recent work of artists Hank Willis Thomas and Emily Scher, who've transformed the Rockwell painting to, quote, reflect the diversity of America today. Of course, not all families in 1943 were as Rockwell depicted. However, this may have been the common image that many people, including most social scientists, held. Today, we recognize and seek to embrace diversity in our country, as Thomas and Scher have done. This Thanksgiving scene, another little fact, is called Freedom from Want. The 1943 version was painted at a time when income inequality in the United States was at a relatively low point. Fast forward to 2018, and not only have we seen increased diversity, but also increased economic inequality. And while we've made some strides toward reducing race and gender inequality, we also see many signs that the discrimination and negative effects persist, and in fact are coming to the fore in public discourse. And we see too that many people are not free from want for food, housing, or other basic needs. When I was thinking about this address, sifting through possible topics, I kept coming back to one conclusion. We're in the midst of what seems to us to be a time of very significant institutional and cultural changes in our world, in the United States and globally. And I felt that I had to address the elephant in the room. I had to somehow address how we as criminologists can respond to these institutional and cultural changes. As researchers, our impact comes through our thinking analytically about changes afoot, conducting careful empirical research, and communicating our findings in various ways that can speak to the field and to our broader communities, including justice system actors, policymakers, legislators, and others in government. Although this address would have been a lot easier for me to write if I decided to focus on my immediate research backyard, which is gender crime and victimization, I decided I had to speak to what I see as an important corollary to recent social and political shifts. That is the evidence of growing social inequalities in our own nation and globally, and connections to crime and justice. We've heard some bad news at this conference, but we've also heard some good news in terms of new research and ideas for further research. I've sensed a great deal of energy, in fact, and I'll motivate the talk with some empirical data about the bad news, of inequality nationally and globally, and then I'd like to make the case that we have an obligation to keep the study of inequality front and center in criminology at this particular moment in time. Then I want to focus on the good news about the work of so many of you are doing to uncover the patterns and mechanisms by which economic and social inequalities are affecting crime, victimization, and experiences with the criminal justice system. And this is, of course, way too tall an order, so I'm only going to sort of provide a sampling. Okay. Oh, good, you can kind of see it. Today, economic inequality in the United States is greater than it has been in the post-World War II period. Economic inequality is a central fact of life in America today, despite our continued rhetoric about meritocracy and equal opportunity. While we've reduced absolute poverty levels since the 1960s, the gap between rich and poor has increased since the 1970s. The graphic on the left is from Redberg and Grusky, and it shows that since the 1970s, there's been an increasing spread in income inequality in the US, with the bottom quintiles declining in shares of resources and the top quintiles rising in shares of resources. Poverty researchers argue that the Great Recession made this problem worse. They have shown that while people in the top quintiles of the income distribution experienced an economic stall during the recession, they have recovered. By contrast, people in the bottom quintiles of the income distribution were hurt hardest by job losses during the recession and have had the slowest recovery. And the very hardest hit by the recession are people who are now facing chronic unemployment and who many scholars argue are not captured in the recent unemployment figures that we have seen because they've ceased looking for work. Eden and Schaefer have called attention to the plight of this group, who they call the $2 a day poor, because they're living on less than $2 a day per household. This group has also been losing income since the late 1990s because of welfare reform. Earned income tax credit and child income tax credit have grown since welfare reform, have grown from welfare reform and have been greatly preferred over the cash subsidy programs like TANF. The EITC and the CITC, which are basically a return on your taxes at the end of the year, have benefited the working poor, which is great. However, the losses in programs that are not income-based has resulted in what economists and poverty researchers have dubbed an extremely poor class, if you will, or to use Eden and Schaefer's term, the $2 a day poor. Of course, economic inequality is not colorblind or gender blind, and people of color and women, especially women with children, are overrepresented among the extremely poor. There's good documentation of this in recent research on poverty. And as such, increasing economic inequality is coupled with race and gender inequality. The big fear voiced by economists, by the way, is that when the next economic downturn hits, it's the extremely poor who are going to be the least able to cope with the effects. At the same time, current policy is moving forward to increase rather than reduce inequality. We've seen tax cuts that favor the wealthy, cutbacks to welfare safety net that serve the extremely poor, chipping away at low-income housing subsidies, attempts to roll back health care reforms, and increasingly restrictive immigration policies. These policies are disproportionately affecting the poor, people of color, and single poor women with children. The graphic on the right is from the economist Raj Chetty and his colleagues. And if you haven't read his work, I highly recommend it. He's pretty impressive. It shows a related phenomenon in the United States where occupational mobility, or doing better than one's parents, is declining. Chetty calls this the fading American dream in his recent Science article with his colleagues. The US isn't alone. Since 1980, the share of income inequality earned by the top 1% has grown around the world. You can see that in the diagram. And the share of income inequality earned by the bottom 50% has shrunk. So it's imperative that we keep inequality central in criminology. And let me just give you three reasons. One reason is that we have empirical evidence that inequality is increasing in the United States and globally. And there's accumulating evidence that when inequality grows, economic inequality grows, we see increasing race, ethnic, and gender inequality in many nations, as well as the US, and we see increasing social problems like crime, unrest, and so on. The second reason has to do with morality. Bear with me a moment here. Moral philosopher, I had just put a little something like this in. Moral philosopher John Rawls wrote A Theory of Justice in 1971. This work's considered by many to be the most important work of moral philosophy in the 20th century. Rawls addressed economic inequality head-on, taking it as both a moral and political issue. He developed what he dubbed the difference principle, which in a nutshell says that everyone has an equal claim to a full scheme of basic rights, and social and economic inequalities have to satisfy two conditions. One is that the opportunities to pursue success must be open and accessible to all. And two is that social and economic inequalities, he maintained that the amount of inequality in a society should be balanced carefully so that the level of inequality works to benefit the least advantaged members of the society. It raises their absolute standard of living and life conditions. Rawls' point here is that when inequality reaches the point where the least advantaged are harmed, it's unfair and immoral. So, think of today. To me, this means that if inequality is associated with crime and victimization because the least advantaged among us are disproportionately exposed to harm such as crime and violence, then it's morally required that criminology reveal and communicate these connections. The goal is to shed light on the problem and thereby contribute to knowledge, but also the goal is to right the moral wrong, the harm to the least advantaged. And if we call attention to some of this disadvantage and the crime that's associated with disadvantage, this seems to be what's required for justice to be achieved in a moral sense. A third reason to keep the study of inequality center stage in criminology is pragmatic. I'm just a pragmatist, actually, at heart. Many contemporary policies seem to be locating primary responsibility within the individual for all sorts of social ills, including crime, criminal justice experiences, and even victimization. This obscures the life conditions and social structures in which crime and violence occur. If we're to speak about policy debates and decisions of our time, we have to be prepared to speak about how the injustices associated with social inequalities are affecting crime and justice. Keeping this study of inequality center stage in criminology is key if we're going to be able to speak about political statements, policies, and legal issues that are desperately in need of enlightenment. We'll be unable to shift the spotlight from the disproportionate focus on the responsibility of individuals to the responsibility of society to address the inequality that underlies crime. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all these. I'm just going to say they're here. Theoretical frameworks are important, though. Theory is important because they orient us to and suggest the important questions that we ask. As we all know, criminology has a very rich history of theory, and some strands of theory have focused specifically on inequalities. From Merton, Sutherland, and Sean McKay through the recent and emerging theories, criminologists have developed explanations of how distributions of resources and power are related to crime and justice. In more recent times, we've seen important theoretical developments focused on socioeconomic inequality, like collective efficacy theory and institutional anomie theory. More recently, we've seen theoretical developments that move beyond focusing only on poverty and economic inequality to move race center stage, such as the theoretical arguments about crime, race, and extreme disadvantage, and the development of Black criminology, which was suggested by Catherine Russell Brown back in the 90s, and now is the subject of a brand new book, I think it's been out 2 weeks, by Univer, Gabadon, and Chewy. In terms of gender inequality, we've seen variants of routine activities theories, routine activities and opportunity theories, feminist theories that frame our understanding of research on violence against women, women's crime, and women in the criminal justice system. So, of course, the study of inequalities in crime also mandates the systematic collection and analysis of data to produce convincing findings. And I promised you good news. And so I think that these are very exciting times in criminology because so many scholars are energized by contemporary social and political events. I really felt that at this conference. At the start of my career, much of the field was focused on theory development and debates about underlying assumptions regarding human nature, behavior, and society. This was my focus as well. This work is intellectually stimulating. It gives us good, strong, clear theories. And I hope that as a field we continue this work because it's always needed and strong theory is really one of our strengths as a social science. Yet a perusal of the breadth of our journals and books today reveals a reinvigorated interest in existing lines of inquiry on inequalities, crime, and justice, and the emergence of new lines of work. Despite the fact that we may be motivated by concern over contemporary issues, this concern has motivated excellent studies that are pushing forward knowledge about inequalities, crime, and justice, and are increasing our engagement with policymakers, legislators, and others in government. And I'd briefly like to highlight a few of the ongoing and emerging strands of empirical research that are tackling issues of inequality, crime, and justice, and that are keeping criminology front and center in terms of knowledge production and policy debates about crime. In keeping with my training in sociology, I'm going to address three overlapping domains of empirical research: economic inequality, race inequality, and gender inequality. And my point here is to emphasize how recent scholarship is helping us to gain a better understanding of the links between social inequalities and crime and to encourage further development of this work. And I have to give a huge caveat. I have time only to note a small selection of current lines of work in each of these domains and offer a few examples, but there are many. So we'll start with economic inequality and crime. There's a long-standing body of empirical research that has focused on economic conditions in crime. There's a contemporary body of research that demonstrates that indicators of economic health, such as employment statistics, the index of consumer sentiment, poverty rates, and poverty rates are associated with fluctuations in crime rates. Although there is at times debate about the best measurement tools and some of the new variables have been introduced in the past decade, there's agreement of late that when economic conditions worsen, crime tends to increase. The most recent important problem that scholars have been working on in this area is the impact of the Great Recession. The existing macro-level work has not revealed the changes in crime that we would expect given the depth and length of the recession. Crime was granted very low at the start of the recession, but given the existing body of theory and research, we'd expect to see some impact of the recession and its recovery on crime. One idea is that criminology might turn to some of the recent research on poverty, which is showing that the Great Recession really affected the most people who are not at the poverty line, but 50% of the poverty line. We might examine what has happened to crime and victimization of this group, the extremely poor, the $2 a day poor. Another long-standing tradition of research has been on communities and crime, and this research has been moving in new directions by illuminating the link between economic inequalities, community organization, collective efficacy, and crime. This research is being conducted by many scholars and often builds on the work of Sampson and his collaborators. Rob's latest book is the seminal statement of this work. This work has been stimulated by many studies of neighborhood structures, cultures, crime, and experiences with criminal justice. Has stimulated many studies. As we saw earlier, economic inequality is also an issue globally. There's a body of research that addresses the connections between inequalities, crime, and violence across nations and within other nations. For example, studies have assessed predictions derived from Mesner and Rosenfeld's institutional anomie theory to assess cross-national differences in economic inequalities, social welfare support, and homicide rates. It's important that scholars keep pursuing this line of work as we see chips in even the great social welfare systems of Europe. Even the model Scandinavian countries are beginning to raise questions about their system in the face of new patterns of immigration and the tensions that have been rising to the surface in some areas. I was in Stockholm last summer and heard people on the street talking about this and almost fell over. Steve Mesner offered an intriguing theoretical analysis yesterday at a presidential thematic panel that I just have to mention. I had to slip it in here because it was so interesting, about how regulatory rollback with regard to financial institutions, the commercialization of institutions like education, the emphasis on business efficiencies, and the dismantling of infrastructures of social welfare support may be coalescing to constitute what he's calling the great retrogression, and to be associated with government's increasing focus on economic efficiencies to the detriment of providing support that can ameliorate economic and social inequalities. So we hope to see that in print soon. Another important way in which criminologists are addressing cross-national inequality and crime is found in the work of Lafree and colleagues. Some slices of this work address different aspects of the link between social and economic inequalities and terrorism, and some slices discuss how inequalities can be connected to declining legitimacy of social institutions and increases in terrorism. There's also a sizable literature in criminology on race and crime. Much of this work, but not all, focuses on race inequality. There's an accumulating body of work now on extreme disadvantage, race, and social isolation. One impetus for this work was the theoretical paper by Sampson and Wilson in '95. Peterson and Crevo developed and tested a perspective on extreme disadvantage, residential segregation, and crime that has become the go-to empirical scholarship in this area now. This line of work has put patterns of poverty and racial segregation at the heart of our understanding about racial inequality and crime. And the conclusion is that the extreme disadvantage and social isolation that characterizes many African American communities has had very negative consequences for community life and for crime rates. This line of work is now growing, and there are extensions that are very promising, and I heard another great example yesterday that was offered during a presidential thematic session. Yesterday, Maria Velez presented a paper which pushes beyond the analysis of black and white neighborhoods to add a comparison of Latino neighborhoods. She asked whether Latino neighborhoods may as a group be becoming more like white neighborhoods over time, or to use Bonilla Silva's term, honorary white. She reported that disadvantage in Latino neighborhoods has improved over time in terms of factors like joblessness, foreclosures, and poverty, and this has not happened in comparison black neighborhoods. And along with this, there's been a greater decline in homicide in Latino than black neighborhoods. This kind of work, I think, opens up important new avenues and is pushing forward our picture of race, disadvantage, and crime. There's also, thankfully, a well-developed literature on the links between immigration and crime. Some scholars, like Ramiro Martinez, have been working in this general area for many years now. While there have been some inconsistent findings in the literature over time, a recent meta-analysis and a literature review by Usi and Kubrin has assessed 20 years of macro-level research from 1994 to 2014, and concludes that immigration is negatively associated with crime rates, but the association's small. But it's certainly not positive overall. The fact that we have 20 years of careful research on immigration and crime allows our field to speak authoritatively to statements that have attempted to link immigration and crime and proposals to tighten immigration policy based on false facts or impressionistic statements about immigrants and crime. This highlights the importance, I think it's a great example of keeping the study of inequalities front and center in criminological research. Finally, I want to say something about race and police-citizen interactions. Race inequality is, of course, coupled with economic inequality, but there are emerging lines of work in criminology that focus on racism itself. above and beyond, and sometimes completely orthogonal to people's economic status. I'm talking here about the quickly emerging and timely literature on race, racism, and police interactions. Some of this work, like the work of Jeff Ward, focuses on long-term and persistent legacies of racism in police interactions. There's a 2017 paper in Criminology and Public Policy by Nix et al. That's documented that among fatal police shootings, people of color are less likely than whites to have been armed. Other work by McCarthy, Hagan, and Herta is focusing on the social isolation and legal cynicism that has emerged in communities of color based on these kinds of interactions. And there's a body of work that's explored the social and political climate surrounding the killings of innocent black men by police officers, such as the edited volume, Trayvon Martin, Race and American Justice by Fasching, Varner, Martin, Albert, and Reynolds. This body of work is emerging, and along with other work that's emerging on the role of the Black Lives Matter movement, is helping to inform and shape public discourse about race and racism in police interactions. There's, of course, a lot more work to be done here, so keep going. Finally, there is quite a large literature now on gender and crime, which wasn't really the case when we started our careers. Most of this literature views gender inequality as a backdrop for sure, but today I'm going to set some scope conditions in my discussion, and I'm going to limit myself to the empirical research that directly targets gender imbalances in resources and opportunities. And again, I focus only on a sampling of this work. First, the idea that changes in women's opportunities and resources would be related to crime is by now kind of a core idea in criminology, having been proposed in the 70s by Frida Adler and Rita Simon. The impact of this work was very great at the time and opened up the study of gender inequality in crime. There were, of course, important subsequent studies by Steffensmeyer on sex-segregated labor in the criminal underworld, and more recent work on sex segregation in white-collar crime by Daly and Steffensmeyer and Schwartz and Simpson and Benson, and work on organized crime that's appearing by Chris Smith. This line of work has been extended over the years to be applied not only to women's offending, but to their victimization. For example, Min Shea, Janet Lauritsen, and I have studied how women's labor force participation, as well as backlash to women's economic success, are associated with different dimensions of violence against women. Another line of work that has assessed the link between gender inequality and crime has focused on how lack of opportunity, indeed the growing gendering of poverty in the United States, is associated with increased offending and with victimization. And there have been both qualitative and quantitative studies in this vein, a lot of qualitative studies for sure, that have showed this association. Another part of this work is the assessment of the relationship between the shrinking welfare safety net, which increases the poverty of the most disadvantaged single women, and changes in women's offending and exposure to violence. Criminologists may further develop work on gender disadvantage, crime, and victimization by turning to the research of welfare and poverty, on welfare and poverty being conducted by economists, who are showing how the specific aspects of the shrinking safety net, such as cuts to TANF, have affected poor minority women of color disproportionately. One of the hallmarks of feminist theory generally is the argument that race, class, gender, sexuality, age, urban residence, and so on work in tandem to create specific lived experiences. So, for example, the experiences of women who are poor, black, young, and urban will differ from the experiences of women who are poor, black, young, and rural, or from women who are poor, white, young, and urban. We must take into account the multiplexity of these structural locations. There are many scholars studying how gender, race, poverty, and urban residence affect crime, violence, and criminal justice. Much of this work has been qualitative at this point, such as the work by Jody Miller, Beth Ritchie, Nikki Jones, and other folks, who have documented that very poor women of color living in distressed urban areas are very vulnerable to violence and negative criminal justice experiences. The challenge for quantitative researchers seeking to study intersectionalities has been that it's tough to assess the interdependent effects of gender, race, and class, especially when the dependent variable of interest is a rare event in a statistical sense. We just didn't have enough data to allow it. However, recently, with the ability to construct very large data files and increases in computing capacity, such analyses are possible. Janet Lauritsen, Joe Lang, and I have been working with the pooled microdata from the National Crime Victimization Survey and are now able to examine race, ethnicity, poverty, age, urban, suburban, rural residents, marital status, and how other factors combine to affect exposure to various forms of violent victimization among women and men. Our findings speak specifically to questions of intersectionality, and along with the qualitative research that exists in this area, these kinds of studies can be used to inform policy about where we need to target our resources. Last slide. I focused here on the good news about the work of criminologists focusing on economic, race, ethnic, and gender inequalities on crime, victimization, and experiences in the criminal justice system. The good news is found in the attention to important issues of inequality in the research that I've highlighted and in lots of other research as well. This work has often been motivated by observations of current inequalities and injustices, and as a body is focusing a spotlight on the consequences of social inequalities for crime, violence, and justice. I'm not going to review Rawls' arguments again. But I think I'll just say that the case can be made for studying inequality based on moral grounds. It's the right thing to do, and we should always do the right thing, right? The study of inequalities in crime also helps make criminology distinct from other disciplines, such as psychology, economics, sociology, and public health. And this is because we speak directly to the influence of inequalities in access to resources and opportunities on crime and justice in some of the ways I've just described. Other disciplines often focus on individual characteristics or intra-individual processes without rooting these in broader social context. Or they tell us a great deal about the processes by which inequalities are generated, but they're not frequently interested in linking those to crime and justice outcomes. Finally, focusing on inequality and crime allows us to speak to the important policy issues of our times. There are many. I've discussed a few here tonight, and particularly highlight the immigration issue. It's very important that we all do our utmost to be communicating our findings broadly so that we can have a voice in shaping the policies, practices, programs, and laws. Indeed, it's essential that we are widely disseminating our findings of research on inequality, crime, and justice beyond the academy. For these reasons, the case can be made that in the current social and political context, research on inequalities, crime, and justice should not only continue, but should expand. Thank you. And now, I need a drum roll. Am I supposed to open this, Chris? And now, I need a drum roll. And please welcome your 2019, well, end of 18 into 19, President of the American Society of Criminology, Mita Chesney-Lind.
Wow.
Now you get to dismiss the meeting.
I had no idea. Aloha. Thank you. Thank you all very much for this great honor. We're looking forward to building on the fine work that Karen and her group did. And in fact, we want to continue the focus on inequalities and continue talking about the terrible burdens that some in our society are forced to bear. And so we're going to be doing that in San Francisco, a very nice environment indeed, and one that I hope we'll all find as a productive work environment next year. So I think my most important job is to let you leave this room and go have a wonderful rest of the evening, and tomorrow work hard and travel safe. And again, aloha and mahalo for this great honor.